In a small, quiet town, a terrible tragedy changed everything. Just months after his wedding, James's new wife, Emily, was found dead under mysterious circumstances. Emily was only in her mid-20s, a young woman with big dreams and a bright smile. She and James seemed happy together, but behind closed doors, tension brewed in the family. His mother, Margaret, had never approved of the marriage, often clashing with Emily over the simplest things. Family gatherings were no longer warm, they became battlegrounds, with Margaret and Emily in a silent war. Then, one night, everything changed forever. Emily's life ended suddenly, leaving James in shock and a whole town full of questions. Was this just a tragic accident, or was there something far darker lurking in the family's history? Many people whispered about Margaret's intense feelings, wondering if a mother's protectiveness had turned into something dangerous. The police began their investigation, digging into the family's past, looking for anything that could explain what had happened. In this story, we'll uncover the hidden truths and strained relationships that led to Emily's last moments. With each detail, you'll get a clearer picture of a family torn apart by anger, secrets, and loss. In a small, peaceful town, a story began that would eventually lead to heartbreak and tragedy. Emily, a young woman in her mid-20s, was full of life. She had recently married James, a man she deeply loved, and together they had hopes of building a happy future. To Emily, everything seemed like a fresh start, a new chapter with endless possibilities. She had always wanted to be part of a close-knit family, and when she met James, it felt like she was finally getting her dream. But in the background, there were unseen tensions growing, silent and unspoken. James's mother, Margaret, had her own ideas about family, and she had always been very close to her son. To Margaret, family was everything, and she had always been protective, even possessive. She had raised James with strong beliefs and high expectations, often reminding him that family comes first. When James brought Emily home as his new wife, Margaret felt as if an outsider was entering their world. She smiled and welcomed Emily at first, but inside she struggled with a feeling of losing control over her son. Margaret believed she knew what was best for James, and she feared Emily would lead him away from her. As days passed, little disagreements started to surface. Margaret made comments about how Emily ran the household, suggesting she wasn't doing things the right way. These remarks seemed innocent at first, but they slowly became sharper, more direct. Margaret often reminded Emily about how things were done in her family, hinting that Emily's ways weren't up to the mark. Emily tried to keep the peace, brushing off these remarks as misunderstandings or simply as the views of an older generation. She thought that, over time, Margaret would accept her and that they would find a way to get along. But instead of softening, Margaret's feelings hardened. She started to interfere in their everyday life more often, offering unsolicited advice on everything from their finances to their personal choices. She would drop by unexpectedly, sometimes even letting herself in without knocking. She believed she was helping, keeping her son's life in order. But for Emily, it felt suffocating. She wanted to build a life with James, but it felt as if his mother was always there, watching, judging, never truly welcoming her. Emily tried to talk to James about it, hoping he would understand her concerns. She told him how Margaret's constant presence made her feel like a guest in her own home. James listened, but he struggled to see things from Emily's perspective. He had grown up with his mother's close involvement in his life, and didn't see her behavior as intrusive. To him, it was normal for Margaret to be involved, even to a large extent. He would tell Emily to give it time, to try and see things from his mother's side. Emily felt isolated, unsure of how to handle the situation. She wanted to respect James's family, especially his mother, but she also wanted space to grow her own marriage. Each attempt she made to bring her feelings to light only seemed to create more friction. Every time she voiced her concerns, James would either brush them off or reassure her that things would settle down soon. But the reality was different. The tension was growing, and it was as if they were walking on thin ice, one small step away from breaking apart. One evening, during a family dinner, things took an ugly turn. Margaret made a remark about Emily's cooking, saying it lacked the care and detail she would put into it. Emily felt hurt, but she kept silent, not wanting to escalate the situation. But Margaret's words continued, slowly turning the atmosphere tense. She criticized Emily's decisions, not just about the meal but about her life choices, subtly hinting that she was not good enough for James. The air grew heavy, and Emily could feel her hands trembling as she held back her response. After the dinner, Emily broke down in private, telling James how much his mother's behavior was affecting her. She pleaded with him to step in, to draw a line that would give them some space. But James was torn, caught between his love for his mother and his loyalty to his wife. He promised Emily he would try to talk to Margaret, but his words felt weak, as if he was unsure he could actually do it. Days turned into weeks, and nothing changed. Margaret continued to assert her influence, and the tension only grew. Emily felt more trapped with each passing day, realizing that her hopes for a close family were slipping away. She began avoiding family gatherings, making excuses to stay home whenever possible. It was her way of finding a little peace, even if only for a few hours. But Margaret noticed this too. She saw Emily's absence as a sign of disrespect, an insult to her family values. To Margaret, Emily was slowly pulling James away from his roots, from the family that had always been there for him. Margaret's resentment grew, fueled by the belief that Emily was intentionally driving a wedge between her and her son. She started making her feelings clearer, no longer hiding her disappointment. She spoke openly about her doubts, telling friends and relatives that she feared Emily was changing James, taking him away from his own family. This undercurrent of anger and frustration was now out in the open, with Margaret no longer willing to hold back her disapproval. For Emily, each day felt like a battle she was losing, and the once promising life she had dreamed of with James seemed further and further out of reach. She could sense the danger building, an unspoken threat that hung over their lives, though she couldn't yet see where it would lead. All she knew was that her attempts to bring peace had failed, and a storm was quietly gathering, waiting to break. As time passed, the tension between Emily and Margaret only grew. Emily felt trapped in a situation where she was constantly judged and misunderstood. Margaret's comments about her choices became harsher, making her feel like she couldn't do anything right in her mother-in-law's eyes. Every decision she made, every word she spoke, seemed to be wrong in Margaret's view. Margaret seemed determined to remind Emily that she didn't belong, as if she were an outsider in her own marriage. Emily tried to talk to James, hoping he would finally see the effect his mother was having on their lives, but he still didn't seem to understand the full impact. Then one day, Margaret made a visit to their home without warning. She didn't bother to call or knock. She simply let herself in, as if it were her own home. Emily was caught off guard. She was alone, busy with household chores, and didn't expect anyone. When she saw Margaret in the doorway, she felt a mix of surprise and dread. Margaret didn't even offer a greeting. She simply looked around, making it clear she didn't approve of the way things were kept. Margaret pointed out every small flaw she noticed, criticizing how Emily managed the household, saying it didn't meet the standards James was used to. Emily tried to stay calm, but inside she felt her patience running out. She tried to remind herself that Margaret was just set in her ways, but Margaret's words cut deeper than usual that day. It felt as if Margaret wanted to break her spirit, to make her feel small and unworthy. Margaret even brought up family traditions and values, implying that Emily was tearing James away from his roots and everything he had been raised to value. Emily had no choice but to stand there, listening to Margaret's hurtful words. She wanted to defend herself, to speak up, but she knew it would only make things worse. After Margaret left, Emily sat down, feeling drained and defeated. She tried to push away the thoughts, telling herself that maybe Margaret would eventually accept her if she continued to be patient. But there was a sinking feeling in her heart, a fear that things would never change. She thought about James, about how much she loved him, and wondered if he would ever truly understand what she was going through. She wanted to believe that things would improve, that time would heal these wounds, but deep down she was starting to lose hope. Days went by, and the distance between Emily and Margaret grew colder. Emily avoided family gatherings, knowing that Margaret's presence would only lead to more uncomfortable moments. James noticed the strain, but still hesitated to intervene. He didn't want to hurt his mother, and he couldn't bring himself to confront her directly. He kept telling Emily that things would settle down, but she felt as though he was just saying it to keep the peace. She began to realize that she was fighting this battle alone, with no one truly understanding the weight of what she was feeling. One evening, as Emily and James were preparing for bed, she decided to try one last time to make him see the reality of the situation. She shared her feelings openly, explaining how Margaret's words and actions were affecting her, how they were making her feel like an outsider. She wanted James to see how much she was struggling, hoping he would finally recognize the pain she was in. She was honest and vulnerable, hoping he would step up and take her side. But James still seemed unsure, torn between his loyalty to his mother and his love for his wife. He promised Emily that he would talk to Margaret, but his words felt empty, as if he was only saying them to calm her down. Emily could sense his hesitation, and it hurt her deeply. She felt like she was losing him, like Margaret's influence was slowly pulling him away from her. She wondered if James would ever truly understand her side or if he would continue to let his mother's presence control their lives. Over time, Emily's patience wore thin. She started to feel as though she had no place in her own home, as if she were just a guest under constant scrutiny. She stopped trying to win Margaret's approval, realizing that no matter what she did, it would never be enough. Her dream of a happy family was fading, replaced by a feeling of helplessness. She began to withdraw, keeping to herself and avoiding unnecessary interactions with Margaret. She felt like she was living on the edge, constantly aware that Margaret could show up at any moment, ready to criticize and judge. Margaret, however, didn't let up. She continued to voice her opinions, both openly and behind Emily's back. She would talk to family members, sharing her doubts about Emily's character and hinting that she wasn't right for James. She painted a picture of Emily as a distant, unworthy wife who didn't care about family values. Margaret's words spread, influencing the way others saw Emily, and she started to feel isolated not only within her home, but within the whole family. It was as if Margaret wanted everyone to see her as the problem, as if Emily was the one causing the divide in the family. Emily was left with a heavy heart, feeling trapped in a situation she couldn't escape. Her love for James kept her going, but she felt like she was slowly losing herself. Each day felt like a struggle, a constant reminder of the life she had hoped for, and the reality she was now facing. She felt alone, with no one truly understanding her pain, and she began to wonder how much longer she could endure the situation. The tension was reaching a breaking point, and she could feel it building, even if she couldn't see where it was leading. She knew something had to give, but she couldn't predict what would happen next. Emily's life became a cycle of tension and avoidance. She went through her days feeling like a stranger in her own home, constantly looking over her shoulder, always expecting Margaret to appear with more criticism. Each day felt heavier than the last, and her spirit began to wear down. She felt alone and misunderstood, and the silence from James only made things worse. It was as though her voice was lost in a storm of unspoken family loyalties, and Margaret's presence overshadowed every part of her life. The weight of the situation was something Emily carried with her every moment, even as she tried to keep her life together. One evening, James returned home later than usual. He looked tired, distant, and when Emily tried to talk to him, he barely responded. She felt a chill, sensing something had changed. That night, James mentioned that his mother had spoken to him earlier in the day, sharing her worries about their marriage. Margaret had told James she believed Emily didn't respect their family, that she didn't understand or value the importance of family unity. She had even implied that Emily might eventually pull him away from his roots entirely. Emily felt her heart sink as she listened to James, realizing how deeply Margaret's influence had reached. It was clear that Margaret wasn't just an observer in their marriage, she was a force that could drive them apart. In the days that followed, Margaret's interference became more direct. She started visiting more frequently, each time making her disapproval of Emily clearer. She would bring up past arguments, remind James of family traditions, and hint that Emily was not fitting in. Her words were chosen carefully, always spoken as if she was trying to protect her son from some unseen harm. Emily found herself becoming defensive, feeling as if she had to justify every choice she made. She knew Margaret was watching her every move, waiting for her to slip up. The atmosphere grew tenser, and Emily sensed that Margaret's resentment was growing, turning into something darker. Emily tried to hold on, hoping James would step in and finally draw a line. But James seemed paralyzed, unable to go against his mother's wishes. He was caught in the middle, torn between his wife and his mother. His silence felt like betrayal to Emily, as if he was choosing Margaret's side by not speaking up. Emily's frustration grew, and she began to withdraw from him, feeling as if her husband no longer cared about her well-being. The distance between them widened, and Margaret's presence loomed larger, as if she were taking over the space that once belonged to Emily. The breaking point came one late afternoon when Margaret arrived unannounced again, but this time there was a different energy about her. Emily felt it the moment she opened the door. Margaret's expression was cold, her eyes sharp, and without hesitation, she began accusing Emily of trying to tear James away from his family. She said Emily was selfish, ungrateful, and only cared about herself. Her words cut deep, hitting every vulnerable place in Emily's heart. Emily felt her patience snap, the weeks and months of silent suffering bubbling to the surface. She found herself speaking up, challenging Margaret's accusations. The conversation turned into a confrontation, a battle of words that had been building for far too long. Emily told Margaret how her constant interference was tearing her life apart. how her marriage was suffering because of the relentless pressure and criticism. Margaret, however, didn't back down. She responded with even harsher words, blaming Emily for all the problems, saying that she wasn't worthy of being part of their family. The argument escalated, voices rising, emotions spilling over. Both women stood face to face, locked in a standoff that had been waiting to happen since the day Emily married James. The tension that had quietly poisoned their lives was now out in the open, raw and undeniable. After Margaret left, Emily sat in silence, shaken by the encounter. She realized that things could never return to normal, that the damage was too deep. She felt exhausted, drained of hope, as if the last bit of energy she had was spent in that argument. The weight of the situation settled over her, a heavy reminder that Margaret's hold on their lives was something she couldn't escape. She began to wonder if there was a way forward, or if her marriage was destined to crumble under the force of Margaret's influence. She felt trapped, knowing that Margaret would never let go, that she would always be there watching, controlling, making her feel like an outsider. In the days that followed, Emily struggled to keep going, to find some sense of peace in the life she now felt disconnected from. James tried to talk to her, but his words felt hollow, as if he didn't truly understand the depth of her pain. He was still loyal to his mother, still unwilling to confront the truth of how much harm Margaret was causing. Emily's heart ached, feeling as though she was drifting away from the life she had dreamed of, as if it were slipping through her fingers. She wanted to hold on, to believe that things could change, but she felt powerless, defeated by a force she couldn't fight. The days turned into a blur of silence and sadness, a routine of avoiding conflict and pretending everything was fine. Emily felt as if she were living a life that wasn't hers, a role she was forced to play in a family that would never accept her. The tension hung in the air, an unspoken threat that haunted her every step. She knew Margaret wouldn't stop, that her control over James would continue to grow. Emily's sense of safety began to fade, replaced by a feeling of dread, a quiet fear that something darker was waiting ahead, something she couldn't escape. In her heart, she felt the warning signs, a sense that the situation was spiraling towards something irreversible. She didn't know what would happen next, but the fear lingered, a shadow over her days. She was no longer just trying to save her marriage, she was trying to protect herself, to find a way to survive in a world that seemed to close in around her with every passing moment. The once bright hope she had carried was now a distant memory, replaced by a silent terror that grew stronger each day. Emily's days began to feel like a slow descent into darkness. The fear that something terrible was coming never left her mind. The house that she once called home felt more like a trap, a place where she couldn't find peace. She felt herself slipping away, as if every part of her spirit was being drained by the constant tension. The arguments with Margaret had reached a new level, no longer hidden behind polite words or quiet disapproval. Margaret's visits grew more intense, each one filled with pointed accusations and harsh words that Emily could no longer ignore. Each visit felt heavier than the last, as if Margaret was pushing her to the edge, testing her patience, waiting to see if she would finally break. Emily's isolation deepened. Her friends noticed her absence, her sudden withdrawal from social events and gatherings. She didn't know how to explain what was happening. Who would understand the torment of living under someone else's control, of feeling like an outsider in her own marriage? She wanted to reach out, to find someone who could listen, but the words never came. Emily knew that Margaret's control extended beyond her presence. It was in her words, her silent threats, her power over James, who seemed unable to see the full extent of his mother's behavior. One evening, Emily and James had another argument about his mother. She asked him again to set boundaries, to finally make a decision about where his loyalty lay. She was desperate, holding on to the last bit of hope that he would step up and protect her from the constant invasion of Margaret's presence. But James was still hesitant, still trying to keep peace between his mother and his wife. Emily felt herself shutting down, realizing that she was truly alone. She knew that her love for James was not enough to keep the life she had envisioned. The dream of a happy marriage had become a memory, replaced by a cold reality where she could no longer see a future with the man she once loved deeply. The final confrontation happened one night when Margaret arrived unexpectedly, her eyes filled with an anger that seemed colder than ever. There was no attempt at small talk or politeness. Margaret went straight to Emily, her words laced with contempt, telling her that she was destroying their family, that she was the cause of all the problems they faced. Emily felt a chill as she listened, her body frozen in place, her mind racing with everything she had held back for so long. She wanted to defend herself, to scream back, to tell Margaret all the ways she had poisoned their lives, but instead, she stayed silent, the weight of Margaret's words pressing down on her like a final blow. As Margaret's words grew louder, more cutting, Emily felt a wave of despair wash over her. She could see no end to this cycle, no hope for peace or freedom. Margaret had made it clear that she would not stop, that she would do whatever it took to drive Emily out. It was no longer a silent war, it was an open battle, one that left Emily feeling powerless and afraid. The thought that had lingered at the edges of her mind now took root, a realization that there was no way to escape Margaret's grasp. The woman was determined, relentless, willing to go to any lengths to regain the control she believed belonged to her. After that night, Emily knew that her days were numbered. She felt like a shadow, moving through her own life with no real purpose, no sense of safety or comfort. Each day felt heavier than the last, a reminder of how much she had lost, how much of herself had been taken away. She tried to keep a brave face, to show some strength, but inside she was breaking piece by piece. The fear she had felt before now settled into her bones, a constant reminder that Margaret's presence was something she could not escape. Emily started to feel as if her every move was watched, as if Margaret was always there, lurking just out of sight. She heard whispers from family members, subtle comments about how she wasn't good enough for James, how Margaret had always known she was the wrong choice. It was clear that Margaret had spread her influence, planting seeds of doubt in those around her. Emily felt the walls closing in, her support slipping away, leaving her completely isolated. She was no longer just facing Margaret alone, she was facing a family that had been turned against her, a life that felt more like a prison each day. In the days that followed, Emily kept to herself, avoiding any unnecessary contact with others, trying to stay out of sight. She moved through her home like a ghost, avoiding James, staying silent, feeling as if speaking up would only make things worse. Her world was shrinking, and she felt trapped in a nightmare she couldn't wake up from. The fear and dread that once lingered at the edges of her mind now consumed her completely, filling every corner of her life with a darkness she couldn't shake. And then, one evening, Emily vanished. Her absence was sudden, unexpected, a disappearance that left everyone in shock. James and Margaret were the first to notice, searching the house, calling her phone, reaching out to friends and family. But there was no trace of Emily. Her belongings were left untouched, her phone silent, her car still parked outside. It was as if she had vanished into thin air, leaving behind only questions and confusion. The town grew tense with whispers and rumors, each person wondering what could have happened, why Emily would disappear so suddenly. The police were soon involved, launching an investigation into Emily's disappearance. They searched the house, questioned James and Margaret, looking for any clue that might explain where she had gone. But the more they looked, the more the situation seemed strange, as if there were secrets hidden just beneath the surface. Margaret's behavior caught their attention. Her responses were cold, detached, her words carefully chosen. James seemed lost, unable to give clear answers, as if he too were trapped in the mystery of his wife's sudden disappearance. The investigation began to pull back the layers of their lives, uncovering the tension and turmoil that had defined their marriage, the silent battles that had filled their days. As the investigation into Emily's disappearance continued, the police began to uncover troubling details that hinted at something far more sinister. Emily's friends shared their concerns, revealing how she had confided in them about the difficulties with Margaret, the constant tension, and the isolation she had been feeling. They spoke of her growing fear, her feeling that she was trapped in a situation she couldn't escape. Emily had told them how she felt like she was being watched, controlled, her every move scrutinized by her mother-in-law. These stories painted a picture of a woman living in fear, isolated, and cut off from any real support. The police grew more suspicious of Margaret. They noticed her behavior during questioning, her calmness that seemed too rehearsed, too cold. When asked about her relationship with Emily, Margaret described Emily as distant, even difficult, as if trying to create an image of a troubled woman. She hinted that maybe Emily had simply run away, unable to handle the responsibilities of marriage and family. But the police sensed something wasn't right. Margaret's words didn't add up, and her attempts to paint Emily as unstable only raised more questions. James, too, was questioned thoroughly. At first he seemed lost, struggling to understand how his wife could have simply vanished. But as the questioning went on, cracks began to show. He admitted that Margaret had not approved of the marriage from the beginning, that there had been countless arguments, most of them about his loyalty to his family versus his loyalty to Emily. He shared that Margaret often voiced her disappointment, blaming Emily for changing him, for pulling him away from his family. The police began to see the pattern, the quiet struggle for control that had defined their lives. Days turned into weeks, and there was still no sign of Emily. The police decided to search the house more thoroughly, looking for any small clue that might explain what had happened to her. They combed through every room, every corner, paying close attention to the basement, the garage, places that were often overlooked. During the search, they found traces of blood in an area of the garage that appeared to have been cleaned recently. The discovery led to further investigation, and soon, the police had enough evidence to believe that something tragic had occurred. Margaret and James were brought in for further questioning, and it was clear that the pressure was beginning to take a toll. James seemed shaken, overwhelmed by the reality that his wife might have been harmed, that the home he shared with her might hold the answers to her fate. Under intense questioning, he finally broke down, revealing that Margaret had always held a strong influence over him, that she had pressured him to keep Emily at a distance, to put family loyalty above his marriage. He admitted that Margaret had often spoken of Emily as a threat, someone who would destroy their family bond. The focus shifted fully to Margaret. Her calm demeanor began to slip, revealing hints of frustration, even anger, as she was questioned further. The police presented their findings, the blood evidence, the statements from friends, and the stories James had shared. Margaret was cornered, her attempts to blame Emily's absence on her character no longer believable. Finally, after hours of interrogation, Margaret confessed to the crime. She admitted to an argument with Emily that had escalated, a confrontation in the garage that turned violent. Margaret revealed how, in a moment of rage, she had acted impulsively, striking Emily and causing her death. Panicked, she had attempted to cover her tracks, cleaning the area and creating a story to explain Emily's sudden disappearance. She thought she could keep control, thought that with enough planning the truth would remain hidden. But the weight of her actions, combined with the relentless investigation, had finally broken her resolve. The town was in shock as news of Margaret's confession spread. Friends and neighbors struggled to understand how a woman who seemed so dedicated to her family, so focused on protecting those close to her, could be capable of such a crime. The image Margaret had worked so hard to maintain crumbled as the truth came to light. Emily's friends mourned her, grieving the loss of a young woman who had only wanted a happy life with the man she loved. The family that Margaret had claimed to protect was now shattered, torn apart by the very person who claimed to hold it together. James was left devastated, caught between the loss of his wife and the truth about his mother. He faced the harsh reality that his silence, his reluctance to stand up for Emily, had allowed Margaret's influence to grow unchecked. He would carry the weight of this knowledge, the painful reminder of how loyalty to family had blinded him to the danger right in front of him. Margaret was charged with the murder of Emily, and as she stood in court, her expression was one of cold acceptance. The truth of her actions was undeniable, and she no longer tried to hide behind excuses or blame. Her control had slipped, her plan had failed, and she was left with nothing but the consequences of her actions. The court sentenced her, and Margaret's story came to a bitter end, her life defined by the very thing she had claimed to cherish: family. Emily's memory lived on, a reminder of a life lost too soon, a young woman whose only mistake was marrying into a family where control mattered more than love.